The report itself was published in 2014, but it was a bit of labor of love really for ourselves, and you know, it was a process that really started about a year and a half before that, really, before the actual publication. And I recall we were both working what at the time was called the School of Education Studies in DCU, based in the other campus. And an email came around really in our department asking if there was anybody interested in doing a little bit of research on fighting words and evaluating the work of fighting words. And it just happened that myself and Irene responded to that particular call. And I think it was down to specific interest that we both had. Certainly from my point of view, I was interested in dialogical practices in education and democracy in education. And from the very little I knew at the time, I felt there was possibly a connection that I could explore a little bit more in relation to fighting words.
Yeah, and like that, I had heard about fighting words. I didn't know an awful lot about them. But from my sense of what I knew, I felt it was an organisation that I'd like to get to know more about, and I myself had an interest in creative writing and in participatory arts practices. So yeah, when the call came in, it was one that interested me, so we both worked together on it then.
And I think there was a certain degree of complementarity between myself and Irene, because obviously she had that background in creativity I didn't have. Although I have an interest in creative arts, I always had. Certainly she had specialized knowledge that I didn't have. And I was coming more from, you know, the philosophical perspective, which would be, if you like, my background. So I think it really worked in that sense, because we were able to bring our expertise to looking with an open, if you like, with an open mind, really, in terms of what could come up from this particular evaluation. I suppose at first, I remember when the research was presented to us by one of our colleagues, there was a suggestion that the research would probably focus on literacy. And I remember both of us kind of were wondering whether that was really the direction we were going to take. So we decided really to go as broad as possible in terms of the research and trying to get the voice of anybody really involved with fighting words. So from, you know, volunteers working in fighting words, from the founders of fighting words, Sean Lobb and Roddy Doyle, the students themselves, and teachers, principals. I think we really tried to capture a broad base, really, and, you know, with interviews, questionnaire, and any kind of, you know, data analysis we could potentially kind of consider, really, in order to collect a broad base of information.
Yeah. So, like Francesca says, it was a case of gathering up as much data as we could from all of those kind of key stakeholders. And then, in addition to that, we were conscious of curricular reform that was happening at the time. So we also kind of linked in with the NCCA that there was a number of events, I suppose, that were happening. So, for example, the particular group of students who were involved in the book project that year, when their work was being launched in the school, we went along to the launch night of that, because we really felt we wanted to experience those different facets, those different aspects of the project. And so there was also there was excitement in the school that night. We saw the parents, we saw the teachers, we were there for the different speeches. So it just gave us great insights into it and made it very real for us in terms of how meaningful this was for the students and for their parents and for the teachers and for the school. It was quite a high profile thing. And then there were other events that we went to, like there was the launch of the stamp, if you recall that, and I'm trying to think.
There was also the workshops. We attended quite a lot of the actual workshops that led to the creation of stories at all levels. You know, I think for primary education students, for post-primary, and for different groups. We also attended tutor training sessions as well. Again, we're really trying to go as broad as possible and really trying to capture the experience really of what is fighting words about and what it means for those who are involved in it.
Yeah, and by visiting the centre, by observing the workshops, by actually meeting the tutors and seeing the whole process kind of unfold in front of us again made it very real for us. So that when we were reading the transcripts or the survey responses, that we also had our own lived experience of it as well, which was really helpful.
I think it was an element of expected and unexpected in it, in the sense that, of course, we were expecting that a development of literacy would emerge from it, and that was the one point that, that initially was kind of mentioned to us as a possible outcome of our research. But ultimately, I think there was a lot more than we expected in the sense that when we looked at, the development of literacy, the love of English, the academic development, certainly were dimensions that emerged from it, but they were only a portion, and possibly, I would say, not the most important one. There was very much a development of confidence in those who participate, a sense of empowerment, sense of voice, and sense of being able to achieve something that they thought that was beyond their means, was beyond their ability. And I think this idea that really kind of emerged very strongly was that everybody can be creative in a very, in different ways according to their own interest, in their ability to express themselves, but that really kind of became a very dominant kind of finding really in our research. Also, other core element of it was that in some way connected to that sense of empowerment is resilience and also the ability to take leadership in whatever the students were doing. I remember one principal in a school in a very disadvantaged area remarked how the students in a school who had taken part in the project were more likely to continue on with their studies when in other occasions, he had witnessed a high level of dropout from school. He also mentioned how these students were actually had a sort of knock-on effect on other students who were taking leadership role. They were trying to motivate other students. And this per se was quite a remarkable finding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it would seem that, this kind of freedom that they had in terms of expressing themselves, that ability to express their ideas gave them tremendous confidence, and that confidence has boosted their self-esteem and then had that knock-on effect in other spheres of their life. And as Francesca has mentioned, that they took on roles within their school where they became like role models, and they took on leadership roles in a way that the particular students, based on what the principals we spoke with and teachers, wouldn't have felt that these were likely candidates for such roles prior to the Fighting Words, in that they could see a marked difference was the key thing in terms of these students as a result of their participation in Fighting Words. So this self-confidence and self-esteem then seemed to just engender this kind of a can-do attitude, where because they experienced and tasted success in one particular domain, it was almost like it had that domino effect, in that they felt that they could then equally be just as successful at something else, that if they were able to draw on their own kind of inner strength and resilience to apply themselves, to see something through to completion, all those things that they learned in the creative writing process, that they were kind of had internalized these and saw how they could now use them in other areas and apply that same kind of thinking to other spheres. So that was something that was really strong, I think, in the data. Well, one of the things was around creativity, and being creative was obviously is one of the key skills at junior cycles. So we looked at, in terms of if the model were to transfer to the formal education system, that we felt that based on the data, a lot of the principals seem to think that perhaps as a junior cycle short course, which was again one of the new things that came in as part of the curricular reform, was that idea that schools could now design their own short courses. And because, especially the schools, I suppose, who had engaged in the year-long book project, they could really see the value of that. And in many cases, there were TY students, so I suppose they thought that it was something that would sit very well within a TY space. But if it was to be a junior cycle, they almost felt it needed to be its own short course, I think was the kind of the main consensus around that.
Yes, and although, obviously, the finding that we had from the study kind of seemed to map very well onto the framework, the junior cycle framework. And at the time, we were only working with the 2012 kind of initial framework. There was a revised version in 2015, but obviously our report was published in 2014. But certainly, there was a sense that, yes, this is a good idea. But what would be required in order to actually transfer this particular model that we see from Fighting Words would be to some extent problematic, because Fighting Words has certain elements that are difficult to replicate in an educational system. So there is a dedicated space that is part of Fighting Words, and that kind of out-of-school experience that the students kind of live through by literally traveling to Fighting Words, which is a different center, a magical center with a magical door that opens and lets you through in a sort of kind of a almost surprising way. And that was something very difficult to replicate in a school environment. At least at the time, that was the suggestion from some of the principals, that if that was to happen, it needed to happen in such a way that it was a sort of on the margin. And it was something that, on one hand, was an interesting finding per se, but it's also something that got us thinking about the extent to which the model of Fighting Words could actually be very much implemented and in very much transferred to an educational system and a formal educational system. And I think at the time we felt that there was great opportunity, as long as we were able to identify what made the Fighting Word model a specific model, and what were the characteristics, and what characteristic we should aim to incorporate in an educational system.
Yeah, and like you say, the physical space was certainly one of the major kind of features of that model. And then in addition to that was the role of the tutors, the volunteer tutors in Fighting Words were seen by all the stakeholders to be absolutely critical component of the model. And so again, I suppose that was a little bit problematic when it would come to the transfer to the formal education, where we simply don't have those ratios in operation, where you have one tutor working in very close partnership with 2 or 3 students, whereas in a classroom environment, there maybe 35, 40 minutes, or in some cases 1 hour, but it's with a teacher with 30 students. Whereas with the book project ones, there was that idea if they were there for an afternoon, they were working in those very small groups with the adults. So that was another thing that was challenging in terms of that transfer.
Yeah, at the same time, I think, while that was a challenge, I think it encouraged us to think about the relationship between the student and the tutor, and what was the element that made that relationship work compared to what happens in an educational setting. And what made it work is the level of informality, that lack of pressure, let's say, that comes from the educational setting, where the relationship is more informal. There is no assessment kind of in that particular space. And we start to wonder, is there a way actually to consider that element of informality, of the type of relationship that is established between the student and the tutor, something that can be replicated in teacher education? So where we think, what can we learn from this that appears to be a difficulty, but it could be potentially something that could be harnessed in order to actually modify the type of relationship that teachers and students can build in a formal educational setting. So I suppose what came up as something that potentially could have been a difficulty in terms of transfer is actually an opportunity in terms of reconsidering the relationship between teachers and students in order really kind of to infuse creativity. I think that the research called into question a number of elements in education. One of them is obviously the relationship between teachers and students, and the fact that creativity requires what, Irene is probably more the expert than I would be, a liminal space almost, a space that it's on the margin of education but is still within education. And it is not really necessarily a physical space, but it's very much an environment that is built between teacher and students, where there is a space of encounter, of relationship building and trust and safety. And this is really what Fighting Words has been doing, has created a safe environment for self-expression. And if we think in terms of infusion of this particular module in a formal education setting, is the recreation of that kind of sense of safety, and that very much that type of relationship that encourages creativity, encourages self-expression. And if we think of the process itself, Fighting Words really kind of opens up the discussion, enables individual students to communicate with each other, to build upon each other's ideas. And there is that dialogical dimension that is very strong and that should really be fostered in educational practice. So I think ultimately Fighting Words offers that kind of bridging between theory and practice and exemplifies really what often we talk about in education, this kind of dialogical practice, democratic practices, but when it comes to actually viewing it and witnessing it in the classroom, that often doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of this can kind of come down to school ethos as well. Something like student voice is something that's probably varies quite a bit from one school establishment to another in terms of kind of the levels of democracy that might be operating within a school structure. So in some schools that's very much to the fore, in others not so much. So in terms of teacher education, for young kind of pre-service teachers who are out on school placement and working in different types of environments, that can be challenging in terms of they can often feel quite, I suppose, restricted by or constrained in some way by the ethos and the fact that they're working with mentors and so on. They don't necessarily feel the same sense of autonomy as they might if they were working full-time in a school. But in terms of teachers then themselves, it could be that you're working in a school that's involved in, for example, the Creative Schools Initiative. It could be a school that's very much into democratic practice and where there's a strong student voice and there's a great openness to this way of working. Fantastic if that's the case, and in such schools you could see how there would be such potential then to try to incorporate more of this type of practice into the school structures. But then for individual teachers who are maybe working in more traditional type schools, where there's perhaps a stronger emphasis on academic performance and the whole points race, and that creativity isn't necessarily top of the agenda, because often in these cases it's not something that parents necessarily want. They'd rather they performed well and were high achieving in the points and all that. So there are those kind of external pressures, and these are the tensions, I suppose, that teachers are faced with in terms of trying to juggle all of this. So for an individual teacher in their own practice in the classroom, if they want to try to promote creativity among their students and they're trying to develop the various key skills, an awareness of the literature, an awareness of the type of findings that have emerged from our research on Fighting Words would certainly be helpful in terms of that kind of openness, the dialogue, giving students the opportunity to express themselves, and that idea of that kind of a platform where the students' work is heard, it's seen, it's recognised, it's validated, and understanding the confidence that goes hand in hand with that and how that can then have those advantages in other areas.
That's great.
Absolutely, and just really to add to that point, and I think you made a very important point, Irene, that there is established practice. There are teachers who are just entering the profession. I think for both really is important really to open up to the idea that creativity offers an opportunity really to build relationship with the students, and fighting words really offers a model of that. It offers an example of that, and I think it's an example that could be valid not only for teacher education but also for continuous professional development, which I think it's also an area that I think Fighting Words is considering, for the future in partnership also with the Institute of Education. So I think really also those established teachers who might have come under pressure, in terms of parents, in terms of assessment, in terms of, whole kind of administrative, structure that now seem very much to weigh down on teachers, these days. So I think there is potential there for both, really, for teacher education, but also for continuous professional development.